Bushranging started in Tasmania when feeding the prison inmates meant convicts were sent into the bush to hunt for bush tucker. Some adapted to the bush by stealing from or trading with settlers they encountered. Their numbers grew as more convicts escaped until the 1850s. In 1814, a pardon promised clemency until the end of the year, which gave them 6 months to prey on the public and then get a pardon. After 2 settlers were murdered by bushrangers in 1815, Lieutenant Governor Davey proclaimed martial law to try bushrangers by court-martial. Several were executed before Governor Macquarie, who revoked martial law. Some settlers who fought bushrangers became popular heroes, like George Taylor of Valleyfield, who captured 2 of the Brady gang, and Margaret Connell, who overpowered a heavily armed bushranger. Don't forget the Batman. Bushranging continued until the 1850s under leaders like Martin Cash, William Westwood, known as Jackie, later hanged on Norfolk Island, and Daniel Priest, the friendly bushranger, who was spared execution by the intercession of several priests and a petition signed by many country people. The most bloodthirsty was John Rocky Whelan, who would shoot then rob his victims. Bushrangers were murderers and torturers, but not all were violent or cruel. They didn't do it to amass wealth, but to survive.
Matthew Brady claimed to fame, prisoner bushranger. Matthew's occupation in England was that of a gentleman's servant like a groom, as he was an excellent and graceful rider with perfect horsemanship. Brady was convicted of stealing a basket of butter, bacon, sugar and rice, and tried at Lancaster on the 17th of April 1820. He received a 7-year sentence of transportation, arriving in Australia in the convict ship Juliana on the 29th of December 1820. Brady was part of a group of 15 escapees from Sarah Island, who sailed a whaleboat around the south coast to the River Derwent and spent the next 2 years as bushrangers. Gentleman Brady treated his victims with fine manners while robbing them. He received, over time, a total of 350 lashes in punishment for misdemeanors and attempts to escape. Matthew Brady's bushranger career could not escape the Batman. Brady was hanged with others. He complained bitterly of being hanged alongside Jeffrey, who was, as Brady pointed out, an informer as well as a cannibal and mass murderer. Martin Cash. Claim to fame, gentleman bushranger, swam shark-infested Eaglehawk Neck. Martin Cash was sent from Ireland in 1827 for shooting a rival suitor in the buttocks. He was sentenced to 7 years penal transportation, and he left Cork Harbour on board the Marquis of Huntly with 170 other convicts. After serving 7 years in Sydney, he left for Tasmania as a free man, only to be charged shortly after his arrival with theft. John Boodle asked Cash to assist him and his brother to brand some cattle which, unknown to Cash, had been stolen. He came before John Giles Price, a magistrate at Hobart Town, who gave him 7 years at the Port Arthur. On one escape attempt, Cash joined forces with experienced bushrangers George Jones and Lawrence Kavanagh to form a gang known as Cash and Company. They stole from wealthy settlers and inns without violence, hence the gentleman bushrangers. Cash was sentenced to death by hanging, but a last-minute reprieve saw him sentenced to transportation for life to Norfolk Island. Cash died in his bed at age 69. Michael Howe. Claim to fame, bushranger, British soldier. This former British soldier Michael Howe arrived in 1812 to serve a 7-year sentence for highway robbery. He arrived in Van Diemen's Land on Indefatigable, the first convict ship. He was assigned to John Ingle, a merchant and grazier, but bolted, declaring that, having served the king, he would be no man's slave. He joined a gang of 29 escaped convicts and army deserters. Howe quickly rose to become joint leader of the bush bandits who ransacked the house of Magistrate Humphrey at Pittwater in 1815 and terrorized the New Norfolk settlement. In 1818, Michael Howe was clubbed to death by fellow bushrangers George Watson, Thomas Worrell, and William Drew on the banks of the Shannon River for the reward of £105 for his capture offered by authorities. He was just 31. They cut Howe's head off to take to Hobart, while his body was left to bleach in the woods. Worrell received a third share of the reward, a pardon from his convict sentence, and free passage back to England. Lawrence Kavanagh. Claim to fame, 5 serious crimes, Woolpack Inn shootout, Anthill Ponds shootout. Lawrence Kavanagh was an Irish-Australian convict who was convicted of burglary in Dublin in 1828. He and his sister were sentenced to death, but commuted to transportation for life. Kavanagh was transported to New South Wales aboard the Ferguson with 40 other convicts, arriving in Sydney. In 1842, Kavanagh, Thomas Brown and Joseph Johnson appeared before the New South Wales Supreme Court. The jury returned guilty verdicts, without leaving the box. The 3 convicted men were sentenced to be transported to Van Diemen's Land for life. Along with 42 other prisoners, he arrived in Van Diemen's Land aboard the schooner Marion Watson, at Port Arthur Penal Settlement. Later that year, he escaped from Port Arthur, with Martin Cash and George Jones to go on a 6-month period of robbing homesteads and inns with impunity. These events eventually led to him being sentenced to death, only to be granted a reprieve by Eardley Wilmot. Sent to Norfolk Island, he was executed in 1846. Mosquito. Claim to fame, bushranger, Indigenous Australian resistance leader. Mosquito, of the Guy Marriable clan, was born in the Hawkesbury, Broken Bay region of Sydney, but left for Tasmania as part of the evacuation of Norfolk Island in 1813. He arrived on the ship the Minstrel in Port Dalrymple. 5 years later he was a servant to the prominent and wealthy Edward Lord, whom some sources say he tracked bushranger Michael Howe on behalf of. Eventually he decided to leave the settlement for the bush and be a bushranger for hire by several groups. Was he the first contract hitman? Bushrangers were not the best of friends to escaping convicts, even though most were convicts before becoming bushrangers. In fact, Alexander Pierce was a bushranger, but only for a month. In 1824 Mosquito was wounded and captured by an Aboriginal boy named Teague. Mosquito and Black Jack were charged with the murder of a stockkeeper and tried without oaths in the Supreme Court, Hobart Town. Mosquito was convicted on dubious evidence, sentenced to death and promptly hanged.
Thomas Jeffrey. Claim to fame, bushranger, murderer, cannibal. Thomas Jeffrey was a convict in Van Diemen's Land in the mid-1820s, transported there aboard the brig Howies in 1822 to Port Dalrymple at the mouth of the Tamar River. He was assigned as an overseer of a work gang at the Georgetown jail. By 1825, Jeffrey left lawful custody, escaping into the bush with 3 other convicts, Perry, Hopkins, and Russell. At one point they tried to join Matthew Brady's bunch, but they were turned down. Jeffrey and his crew were subsequently responsible for 5 murders by extreme violence, including the killing of a 5-month-old infant. A member of his own gang was shot while sleeping and consumed by the other 2. Captured in 1826 and tried in Hobart, where he was convicted, then executed by hanging.
William Westwood. Claim to fame, bushranger, cooking pot uprising. Born in Essex, Westwood had already served 1 year in prison for highway robbery before his transportation at age 16 to the penal colony of New South Wales on a conviction of stealing a coat. After a prison escape history on the mainland, they shipped William Westwood off to Port Arthur, Van Diemen's Land for life in 1842. Westwood tried to escape from Port Arthur twice, but received 100 lashes for each. The next year he escaped by swimming the channel, but 2 companions with him were eaten by sharks. Later that year he was captured and sentenced to 12 months hard labor and solitary confinement. The new commandant promoted Westwood to his boat crew. He was sent to Glen Orkney on probation after rescuing 2 drowning men. Returning to bushranging, was captured and transported to Norfolk Island. There, he led the cooking pot uprising, killing 3 constables and an overseer himself. He was captured and executed with 11 others.
Sutherland and Ogden. Claim to fame, babyface bushrangers. James Sutherland, seen on the left, 18, was sentenced to 3 months at the Hobart jail for being idle and disorderly. That's where he met James Ogden, seen on the right, 19, charged with larceny. They immediately became besties. Together, they did a little bushranging in Epping Forest and were said to only emerge from the bush to visit brothels and drink. On one such occasion Sutherland murdered 2 men, William Wilson and Alfred Holman. The first, William Wilson, was shot after leaving his house, which they then burnt down. Alfred Holman was shot while driving a wagon through the forest. Both crimes were as shocking in their violence as they were tragic in their aftermath. They went on a crime spree for weeks in the aftermath of the murders. Both were executed in Hobart in 1883.
Rocky Whalen. Claim to fame, Rocky Whalen's Cave. John Rocky Whalen was the most bloodthirsty of Tasmania's bushrangers. Described by Martin Cash as so callous and hardened that he seemed to regard the lash, the dark cell, and the rest of Price's contrivances with indifference. Cash knew Whalen from their Norfolk Island days. He'd been transported to Norfolk Island when he was involved in the taking of the supply vessel, Governor Phillip. 18 years on Norfolk Island saw 40 offenses and earned 700 lashes. When Norfolk Island closed, Rocky was transferred to Port Arthur. One of his hideouts was a cave on Mount Wellington, overlooking Hobart, known as Rocky Whalen's Cave. He met and killed Mr. Dunn, a young storekeeper from Franklin. Rocky carried a double-barreled pistol, loaded and capped, and a large amount of cash. He was sentenced to death by hanging in 1855.
Daniel Priest was a convict and bushranger in 19th-century Tasmania. Priest escaped from Port Arthur and became a bushranger known as the Friendly Bushranger, due to his almost unparalleled mildness and kindness towards persons with whom he came into collision with in pursuit of his lawless career. Priest held up settlers at gunpoint, but only took what he needed, and was never violent. George Lucas, who had been robbed, claimed the coat and trousers worn by Priest were his. Priest replied, "Yes, you're right, they're yours. You have told a very correct yarn. All that you have said is very true." Priest was sentenced to hang, but after the intervention of many members of the public, including 3 priests and several people who he had robbed, his sentence was commuted to 10 years at Norfolk Island. Not exactly a picnic spot unless you're a sadomasochist.